Caliban was a forest that undersells it. Caliban was a world where the forest had won, where the trees grew so dense and so old that the continents were effectively a single canopy, and where the things living under that canopy had been twisted by something in the warp into what the Calibanites simply called great beasts. These were not animals, they were mutations the size of buildings, and they were winning. Human civilization on Caliban survived in fortress monasteries, walled orders of knights who spent their entire lives clearing the ground immediately around them and then holding it, not conquering. A Caliban knight's life was a permanent siege against a forest that grew back faster than it could be cut. Lion L. Johnson was found in the deepest part of that forest, alone, as a child, surviving among the beasts, not sheltered by them, surviving them. By the time the knight Luther found him, he had no language, no name, and no concept of another human being, and he had already learnt the only lesson Caliban taught, which is that the threat is always in the trees, and the moment you relax, it takes you. That is the flaw the world amplified. The lion was born with an extraordinary strategic mind. Caliban taught that mind to trust nothing, and to explain nothing, because on Caliban explaining yourself cost you the second you needed. He became a commander who planned perfectly and shared nothing, and the men around him consistently mistook his secrecy for contempt. The Dark Angels inherited all of it, the most secretive legion in the Imperium, organized into an inner circle inside an inner circle, keeping its own counsel even from the Emperor. And when Luther eventually turned against the lion, the betrayal came from exactly where Caliban always said it would, from close by, from inside the walls, from someone who had been standing next to him the whole time. The Second Legion had a Primarch. He had a Homeworld. Both were erased. We know the Legion existed because the numbering requires it. There is a first and a third, and the Imperium does not skip numbers. We know something happened because every mention was struck from the record, deliberately and thoroughly, in an empire that otherwise cannot manage to count its own planets accurately. What we do not have is a name, not the Primarchs, not the worlds, not the legions. In the lore they are called the Forgotten and the Purged, and those are descriptions, not names. Everything else is speculation, and it is worth being honest that it is speculation. Something happened that was serious enough that the Emperor, who tolerated Angron's butchery and Kurz's terror and Conrad's massacres, decided this could not be allowed to exist even as a memory. Remember that when you hear people say the Emperor was too forgiving with his sons. Chemos was dying when Fulgrim landed on it, and it had been dying for a long time. It was a mining world stripped so thoroughly that the topsoil was gone, the water was gone, and food had to be synthesized in factories that ran continuously because the moment they stopped, people starved. There was no leisure on Chemos. There was no art, no music, no ornament of any kind, because every hour that was not spent producing was an hour the population moved closer to extinction. Children worked. The elderly worked until they could not. A Chemosian measured a life by output. Fulgrim landed there, and, within a few years of reaching adulthood, had turned the whole planet around. He reorganized the mines, restarted dead factories, and pulled Chemos back from collapse through sheer relentless improvement of every system he touched. And here is what the world did to him. Chemos taught Fulgrim that the answer to any problem is to be better, and that stopping is the same thing as dying. It gave him a genuinely heroic work ethic, and underneath it, a conviction that any imperfection anywhere is an emergency. That is not a small flaw. That is the exact shape of the hook that Slanesh needed. The Emperor's children became the Legion of Perfection, the finest swordsman, the finest marksman, the finest everything, and they said so. They pursued the perfect execution of every art of war, until pursuing it became the only thing they were, and when a diamond offered them sensations no mortal had ever experienced, they took it, because a Chemosian cannot refuse an improvement. Olympia was a world of mountain city-states, and it had been at war with itself for as long as anyone could remember, not open war, most of the time. Olympian warfare was the slow business of surrounding a fortified city on a mountain and waiting, and Olympian politics was the business of betraying whichever ally had become inconvenient. Prospero was found by the tyrant of Lokos, who raised him as a son and never once trusted him. He grew up brilliant, genuinely, measurably the most gifted engineer among the 20, and he grew up watching the man who raised him quietly prepare for the day Prospero would turn on him. He never did. That is the tragedy of Prospero. He was suspected constantly, and he never actually betrayed anyone until the day he did it completely. Olympia amplified a flaw that was already there, a hunger to be recognized, paired with an absolute refusal to ask for recognition. Prospero believed that excellent work should be seen without him having to point at it. Olympia taught him that it never is. The Iron Warriors got the worst assignment in the Great Crusade, where other legions took worlds and moved on to glory. The Fourth were left behind to hold them. Garrison duty, siege work, the unglamorous grinding jobs that nobody wrote songs about. They took the hardest tasks in the Imperium and received nothing for it, and their Primarch, who was constitutionally incapable of complaining, let the resentment compound for 200 years. When Horus offered him a place, Prospero did not need to be corrupted, he just needed to be asked. Chogoris was steppe, vast open grassland, seasonal, brutal in winter, and populated by nomadic tribes who lived on horseback and settled nothing. In the lowlands there were cities and a nobility that regarded the steppe tribes as animals to be hunted for sport. Jagatai Khan was found by a nomad chief and raised in that world, and the lesson Chogoris taught was purely mechanical. On open ground, the faster force wins, not the stronger one, the faster one. A rider who can strike and be gone before the response arrives can defeat an enemy 10 times his size, indefinitely, forever. He proved it by unifying the entire planet in a campaign that took years rather than decades, and he did it by never once holding a position he did not need. What Chogoris amplified in him was not a weakness in the ordinary sense. It was a deep and permanent impatience with anything that slowed him down, including explanation, including politics, including the imperial court. The Khan was the Primarch nobody could reach, and during the Heresy, when both sides desperately needed to know which way the Fifth Legion would go, nobody could get an answer, because the Khan was already moving. The White Scars became the fastest legion in the Imperium, masters of the strike that never stops to consolidate, brilliant, and almost impossible to coordinate with. Fenris is the world that gets described as a death world, and for once the label undersells it. Fenris has an unstable orbit. Its land masses are seasonal. Islands rise and are swallowed again as the ice advances and retreats, which means that the map of the planet is different from one generation to the next. There is no permanent geography. There is nothing to build on that will still be there. The human population lives in the mountains, in tribes, and the mortality rate is such that a Fenrisian who reaches 40 is genuinely old. The wildlife includes the kraken and the great wolves, and both of them eat people regularly enough that it is simply part of the culture. Lemon Russ was found being raised by wolves. That is not a metaphor. He was taken in by a pack, and by the time King Thengir's hunters found him he was hunting alongside them. Fenris amplified something the Emperor had built deliberately, and perhaps should not have. Russ was engineered as the Emperor's executioner, the sun sent when a matter needed ending rather than solving. Fenris took that and taught it that everything is a kill or be killed proposition, and that hesitation is the thing that gets you eaten. The Space Wolves are the result. The legion that is sent when the Imperium has decided that a problem should stop existing, and when the Emperor needed Prospero disciplined, he sent the one son whose entire world had taught him that there is no meaningful difference between disciplining something and destroying it. Inwit was a world in permanent winter, so cold that the human population survived only inside sealed structures, not cities in the ordinary sense, closed, hierarchical, rationed environments in which every resource was accounted for, and every person had an assigned function. The Inwit system was ruled by the House of Dawn, a merchant guild that had held power through generations of absolute discipline. Rogel Dawn was found there as a child, and raised by the guild's leader, whom he called grandfather. What Inwit taught was that the wall is the only thing between you and death, and that the wall does not care how you feel about it. Maintenance is not heroic. It is simply the difference between living and not. An Inwitter's virtue is endurance without complaint. Dawn absorbed that so completely that it became the defining fact of him. He was the most honest of the Primarchs, and the least diplomatic, because Inwit had taught him that flattery is a waste of a resource. He said what was true, to anyone, including the emperor, and it cost him repeatedly. The imperial fists became the imperium's builders and its defenders, the legion that fortifies, holds, and endures. When the heresy reached Terra, it was Dawn who turned the imperial palace into the greatest fortification in human history, and it was Dawn who stood in it and did not move. The flaw Inwit amplified was rigidity. Dawn could not bend, and he could not forgive himself for the walls that fell. Nostramo had no sun, not literally none. It orbited a star, but the atmosphere was so thick with industrial pollutant that daylight never reached the surface. The population lived in permanent darkness in hive cities built on top of adamantium mines, and the mines were the only thing of value the planet had. The society was run by criminal syndicates, not corrupted by them, run by them, openly, as the actual government. Law existed on paper. In practice, whoever could enforce their will did, and the ordinary population lived in a state of continuous low-level predation. Conrad Kurz was found alone in that city as a child, and he raised himself. He also had visions. The Night Haunter saw the future, involuntarily, including his own death, and there was no one anywhere on Nostramo to explain to him what was happening. So he did the only thing the world had taught him. He found the criminals and he killed them, and he made the killings visible enough that the population changed its behavior. It worked. Crime on Nostramo collapsed, not because people became good, but because they became terrified. That is the flaw Nostramo amplified, and it is a subtle one. Kurz did not learn that violence is enjoyable. He learned that fear is the only mechanism that reliably changes behavior, and having learned it in the only laboratory available to him, he could never be argued out of it. The Night Lords became the Imperium's terror weapon, and the Imperium used them, and then condemned them for being what it had used. Kurz went to his execution having concluded that he had done exactly what he was built to do. Baal Secundus was a moon of a dead world, and the whole system had been ruined in humanity's own past. The dark age of technology ended there in nuclear fire, and what remained was a radioactive desert where the surviving human tribes lived among mutation and thirst. Everyone on Baal Secundus was mutated to some degree. That was normal. The tribes distinguished between the pure, those whose mutations were survivable, and the twisted, and both categories were fighting over the same handful of habitable places. Sanguinius landed there and was born with wings, which on any other world would have marked him as a mutant to be destroyed. On Baal Secundus, where everyone carried something, it marked him as an angel. That is the accident that shaped him. Sanguinius grew up beloved, the only Primarch who was simply, uncomplicatedly loved by the people who raised him, and he grew up in a place where physical corruption was universal and had to be lived with rather than cured. The flaw the world amplified was not in his character, it was in his blood. The blood angels carry the red thirst and the black rage, genetic flaws that no apothecary has ever corrected, and their whole culture is built around managing a corruption they cannot remove. Baal Secundus taught that lesson first. You do not eliminate the taint, you contain it, and you live your life inside the containment. Sanguinius also saw his own death, and went to it anyway. He is the only Primarch who did that. Medusa was geologically unfinished. The crust had never stabilized, and the surface reorganized itself continuously through volcanism and tectonic upheaval, so that a landmass was a temporary feature. Ash storms scoured everything. The human clans lived nomadically and rebuilt constantly, because building something permanent on Medusa was a category error. Medicine clan culture responded to that by fusing itself to machinery. Prosthetic augmentation was not medical on Medusa. It was aspirational. Flesh failed. Metal did not. A clansman who replaced a limb had improved himself. Ferrus Manus earned his name on that world. In the story where he wrestled the silver serpent Esirnoth, and forced his hands into it until the living metal fused to them permanently, his arms to the elbow became metal, and he could shape steel with his bare hands afterwards. The flaw is right there in the founding legend. Ferrus concluded that weakness is a thing to be burned out and replaced, and Medusa agreed with him at every turn. He held himself and everyone around him to a standard that permitted no failure of nerve at all. The Iron Hands took it further than he did. After Ferrus was killed at Istvan V, killed by Fulgrim, whom he had loved, The Legion decided that the flaw was that their Primarch had still been partly flesh. They responded to grief by amputating more of themselves. The 10th Legion's answer to losing a father was to become less human. The 11th Legion, like the 2nd, was removed from the record. Same treatment, same completeness, and no name survives for the Primarch, or the world that raised him. There is one difference worth noting. The 2nd and the 11th were erased at roughly the same point in the timeline, and the erasures were done to the same standard. That suggests one decision rather than two separate incidents, which in turn suggests that whatever they did, they may have done it together, or that whatever happened to them happened to both. The Imperium's own records do not admit that these legions ever existed. The number is simply absent, and the absence has never been explained by anyone with the authority to explain it. 2 of the Emperor's 20 sons are missing, and the Imperium's position is that there were never 20. Nuceria was a civilized world. That is important, because it is the one detail people forget when they tell this story. Nuceria had cities, a wealthy ruling class, agriculture, and a functioning economy. It was not a death world or a wasteland. It was a comfortable place, for some people. It was comfortable because it ran on slaves, and its slave-holding class entertained itself with gladiatorial combat. Angron landed in the hills and was captured almost immediately, and rather than being raised by anyone, he was fitted with the butcher's nails. These were neural implants, driven directly into the brain, that flooded him with rage and pain, and rewarded him only when he was killing. They were not removable. Attempting to remove them would kill the host. Understand what that means. Angron was not a Primarch who became angry. He was a Primarch whose capacity for anything other than anger was surgically destroyed in childhood by people who wanted a better show. He escaped, raised an army of fellow slaves, and made his stand on a mountainside against the Nucerian armies. And that is where the Emperor found him, and teleported him away alone, leaving his brothers and sisters to be slaughtered without him. Angron never forgave it. The World Eaters took the nails voluntarily to be closer to their father, which is the single most tragic decision any legion ever made. A legion of men who chose to have their minds destroyed in order to understand a man whose mind had been destroyed against his will. Macragge is the exception, and the exception proves the pattern. Macragge was a functioning civilization, a meritocratic state with a working constitution, a professional army, an education system, and a ruling council that governed rather than merely holding power. It was cold and mountainous, and not especially rich, but it was ordered, and it had been ordered for a long time. Roboute Guilliman was found by Connor, one of the 2 consuls, and raised as the son of the man who ran the planet. He was educated in law, administration, logistics, and command, formally, from childhood, by people who were good at all 4. So what flaw did Macragge amplify? The same one it gave him as a strength, which is a total confidence that a well-designed system will hold. Guilliman believes in institutions. He built the Codex Astartes, which reorganized every legion in the Imperium into a rational structure, and he built Ultramar, which is the only part of the Imperium that has ever been run competently, and his brothers found him unbearable for it. The Ultramarines were the largest and best organized legion, and every other legion resented them, and Guilliman never fully understood why, because on Macragge competence had always been rewarded. 10,000 years later he woke up into an Imperium that had turned his rational system into a religion, and discovered that the flaw in believing in institutions is that institutions outlive the reasons they were built. Barbarus was poisoned. The atmosphere at ground level was breathable, barely, and it got worse with altitude, a rising gradient of toxic fog, so that the higher you climbed, the more lethal the air became. The human population lived at the bottom, in the thin band where survival was possible. The things that ruled Barbarus lived at the top, in the poison, and came down to take people whenever they wanted. They were warlords, sorcerers, and almost certainly warp entities, and to the humans below they were simply beyond reach. Mortarion was taken as an infant by the greatest of them and raised as a son, in the high toxic altitudes, and he survived there because his physiology adapted. He grew up as the only human-shaped thing that could breathe the poison, and so he spent his youth climbing. He would push himself a little higher each time, building tolerance, working toward the altitude where his adoptive father lived, so he could kill him. He never quite made it. He collapsed short of the summit, and the emperor arrived and finished the climb and killed the overlord for him. That is the flaw Barbarus amplified, and it is the single cruelest one in the whole list. Mortarian's entire identity was built on the idea that he would endure his way to the top under his own power, and the emperor took that from him in an act of kindness. The Death Guard became the Legion of Endurance, men who could march through anything and simply not stop, and they ended up as Nurgles, which is the god of endurance turned inside out, of surviving so completely that you cannot die even when you should. Barbarus taught them to tolerate poison. Nurgle simply offered more of it. Prospero was a haven, and that made it the most dangerous world on this list. The planet was largely desert, but the city of Tizca was a place of glass towers and libraries, and it was populated by psychers, not sanctioned ones, not hidden ones. Prospero was a society in which psychic ability was normal, taught in schools, organized into disciplines, and used openly. That is remarkable, and it is also, in the universe these people live in, a completely unshielded reactor. Magnus landed there, and was the most psychically gifted being the galaxy had produced outside of the Emperor himself. And Prospero, which had never had a reason to be afraid of psychic power, taught him to be curious about it without limit. The flaw is not arrogance, exactly. It is a specific and fatal confidence that knowledge is neutral, that a thing can be studied without being touched by it. Magnus made a bargain with Tsiunch as a young man to save his legion from mutation and told himself he had won the exchange. And when he learned that Horus would turn, he used sorcery to warn his father, punching through the Imperial Palace's psychic defenses to do it, and shattered the Emperor's Webway project in the process. He was trying to help. That is what makes it terrible. The Space Wolves were sent to Prospero, and Tizca burned, and the 1,000 Suns went to Tzeentch, where the god of knowledge and change gave them exactly what Prospero had promised, and took everything else. Cthonia was already dead when Horus landed on it, not uninhabited, dead in the sense that everything of value had been extracted. It was one of the oldest human colonies, close to Terra, mined continuously for so long that the planet was hollow, a shell of tunnels with the surface stripped bare. What lived in the tunnels were gangs. Chthonian society was gang society, top to bottom, and the only route to anything was to join one, rise inside it, and take it. Loyalty on Cthonia was real but transactional. You were loyal to the gang that fed you, for exactly as long as it fed you. Horus was found there and raised in it, and he was found first, before any of the others. He spent decades alone with the Emperor, learning directly from him, before a single one of his brothers was recovered. Cthonia amplified charisma. Horus could read what a man wanted and give it to him, because that is the only survival skill a Chthonian gang has. He was the most beloved of the Primarchs, and the most naturally political, and the Emperor made him Warmaster because he was genuinely the best choice. And here is the flaw. Cthonia taught him that the leader is the man everyone follows, and that a leader who is not followed is nothing. So when the Emperor withdrew to Terra and stopped explaining himself, Horus did not experience it as a change of duties. He experienced it as being abandoned by the only gang that had ever mattered to him. The Chaos Gods did not have to invent his grievance. They just had to confirm it. Colchis was a desert world running on faith. The population was poor, the climate was hard, and the entire civilization was organized around a religion, the Covenant, administered by a priesthood that held real political power. That religion was not empty. Colchis's holy texts spoke of a coming savior, and they had been speaking of it for a very long time. This is a world where prophecy was the organizing principle of public life. Lorgar was found by Corpheron, a priest, and raised inside that priesthood. He grew up brilliant, devout, and utterly certain that the universe had a divine shape and that his purpose was to find it. Then the Emperor arrived, and Lorgar recognized him as the fulfillment of every prophecy he had ever read, and began building a religion around him. The Emperor's response was to destroy the city of Monarchia, a beautiful city built entirely in his honor, and make the word-bearers kneel in its ashes while Guilliman's legion looked on. Colchis had amplified in Lorgar an absolute need to worship something. It was the load-bearing wall of his entire personality, and the Emperor knocked it down in public without offering anything to replace it, in front of the one brother Lorgar most wanted to impress. Lorgar did not lose his faith at Monarchia. He lost his object, and the ruinous powers, who had been in the Colchisian holy texts all along, were waiting with a replacement. Nocturne is a volcanic world with an orbit that brings its moon close enough to trigger planet-wide seismic upheaval on a regular cycle. The population knows when it is coming. They evacuate to the sanctuary cities. The mountains erupt, and afterwards they come back out and rebuild. That cycle is the whole culture. Nocturnian life is organized around the certainty that everything you build will be destroyed on schedule, and the equal certainty that you will rebuild it. They are the finest artisans and smiths in the Imperium, precisely because they have had to make everything twice. There is a second pressure. Nocturne was raided by the Dark Eldar for generations, who came for slaves, and the population fought them off with what they had. Vulcan landed in that world, and was raised by a blacksmith. He grew up making things and defending the people around him, and both halves of that are equally important to who he became. So what flaw did Nocturne amplify? This is the entry where the answer is unusual, because Nocturne's lesson was compassion, and compassion is not a flaw. What it produced was a Primarch who consistently put civilian lives above military objectives, and a legion that will accept casualties to avoid inflicting them. That is not a weakness in any moral sense. It is a weakness in a galaxy where every other faction will exploit it, and the salamanders have paid for it in blood every time. Vulcan is also a perpetual. He cannot permanently die. Nocturne, the world that is destroyed and rebuilt forever, produced the sun who does the same thing. Corvus Corax did not land on a planet. He landed on a moon, and the moon was a prison. Lachaeus orbited Kiava, an industrialized forge world, and the moon existed to supply it. The prisoners mined it. They were not serving sentences in any meaningful sense. They were born there, worked there, and died there, and their children inherited the sentence. The guilds on Kiava below owned them completely. Corax was found in that prison population and raised by it. He grew up as one of them, and by the time he had grown, he had done what no one had managed in generations. He organized a rebellion, took the moon, and then turned its mass drivers on Kiava, and forced the guilds to surrender. He renamed the moon Deliverance. The flaw Lycaeus amplified is the hardest of these to state fairly, because it looks like a virtue from every angle. Corax believed that the oppressed should be freed, and that the people doing the oppressing forfeit consideration. He is the most morally clear of the Primarchs. What that produced was a commander who took things personally in a way the others did not. After the drop site massacre, when the 19th Legion was reduced to a few thousand survivors, Corax tried to rebuild it fast using the Emperor's own Primarch-grade gene technology, and it went wrong, and he created something monstrous. He gave those creations mercy in the end, and then he left. The last thing anyone heard from Corvus Corax was a single word: nevermore. We do not know where Alpharius came from. That is not the same as the 2nd and the 11th. Those were erased by someone else. This one appears to have been erased by the Alpha Legion itself, and the difference matters because it means it worked. There are accounts. There is a world called Fenlock. There are suggestions Alpharius was found last and raised partly by the Emperor directly. There are claims Horus found him. There is also the fact that there were two of them, Alpharius and Omegon, twins, and the Imperium did not know that for most of the Great Crusade. Every one of those accounts comes from a source the Alpha Legion had access to. So what did the Homeworld do to the Primarch? Here is the honest answer. We cannot say, and that absence is itself the answer. Every other legion on this list can be read backwards from its world. The Alpha Legion cannot, because the 20th understood before anyone else that being legible is a vulnerability. They took the Emperor's own lesson, that information wins wars, and applied it to themselves first. Alpharius was killed by Rogel Dawn during the Heresy, and Guilliman is said to have killed Omegon afterwards, and neither death is certain, because certainty is the one thing the 20th has never allowed anyone to have. Lay them out together, and the pattern is not subtle. The sun engineered for rage landed in a gladiator pit, and had rage nailed into his skull. The sun engineered for faith landed on a world of prophecy, and had his faith publicly destroyed. The sun who saw the future landed in a city with no sun, and learnt that only fear works. The sun, built for endurance, landed at the bottom of a poison gradient, and spent his youth climbing toward a summit he was never allowed to reach. Not one of these is a mismatch. Every single world sharpened the exact quality that would later break the man standing on it. The Imperium's official position is that the scattering was a warp accident during an attack on the Emperor's laboratory, and that may be true, but an accident that lands 20 specific children on 20 worlds, precisely calibrated to their individual weaknesses, is not an accident in any sense that the word usually carries. Here is what the law will not confirm, and it is worth being clear that it does not confirm it. We do not have a text in which a chaos god states that the scattering was their doing and explains the targeting. What we have is 20 data points that all fall on the same line. And there is one more thing worth sitting with. The Emperor found every one of these sons as an adult, or nearly. He never raised a single one of them. Whatever these worlds made, he inherited, and then he tried to command it as though the making had not happened, and he never once asked any of them what their world had done to them. 9 of them turned. That is not a coincidence either. Which homeworld do you think did the most damage? And if you think I have the wrong read on the scattering, say so. I will look into it properly for a follow-up.